At his own 70th birthday dinner, a father watched his daughter raise a glass and thank the real man who raised her, her stepdad, while he sat there smiling in front of a room full of guests. What he did the following week divided the entire family, and to this day, most people say he went too far. But I want to know what you think. Stay with me till the end as I narrate the story. Before we get into it, if you enjoy real, emotional family stories like this one, take a second to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Now let me tell you everything from the beginning. To the real man who raised me. The words came out steady. Practiced. My daughter stood at the head of the long banquet table, champagne glass lifted, the candlelight catching the rim like it was part of the performance. 70 years old, and I had never felt smaller. Before anyone could process what she'd said, she turned toward Daniel, her stepfather, leaned in, and kissed his cheek. Applause followed. Not thunderous. Polite. Confused. I kept smiling. The restaurant had closed off its private room for the night. White tablecloths, folded napkins shaped like swans, a custom cake that read Happy 70th, Dad in blue icing. I had paid for most of it, though she insisted it was her gift to me. That detail didn't sting at first. The sting came from watching her wrap her arm around Daniel's shoulders as if I were the guest of honor in name only. And in that moment, before the candles were blown out and before the waiters began slicing cake, I understood something irreversible had just happened, even if no one else in that room wanted to admit it yet. My sister Carol, seated 2 chairs down, leaned toward me and whispered, "You okay?" She tried to say it casually, like she was commenting on the wine. I nodded without looking at her. Across the table, my old business partner avoided eye contact altogether. He focused hard on buttering his roll. I realized then that humiliation is rarely loud. It settles over a room like dust. Everyone feels it, but no one wants to be the first to wipe it away. Daniel stood slowly when the clapping died down. "I didn't do anything special," he said, placing his hand over my daughter's. "I just showed up." The room hummed with approval at that line. Showed up. Such an ordinary phrase. Such a loaded one. I let out a soft laugh, the kind you give when you're pretending something is charming instead of calculated. I even raised my glass toward him. I don't know if he saw the tremor in my hand. What no one mentioned, what no one at that table seemed interested in revisiting, were the years before Daniel existed in her life. The years when I drove 40 minutes each way to coach her soccer games after 12-hour shifts. The years I paid child support on time, every time, even when it meant putting groceries on a credit card. The years I sat alone in a 2-bedroom apartment because the house had gone to her mother in the divorce, and stability for my daughter mattered more than square footage for me. I wasn't perfect. I knew that. But I had been present. And presence, I once believed, counted. A waiter approached my shoulder. "Sir, would you like to say a few words?" he asked gently. He had no idea what he was walking into. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and looked at the faces gathered around the table. Colleagues, cousins, neighbors, and Daniel's extended family, who had somehow become part of my milestone celebration. I thanked everyone for coming. I thanked my daughter for organizing the evening. I even thanked Daniel for loving her. The room relaxed at that. They wanted grace from me. I gave it to them. What I didn't give them was honesty. 2 days later, I received a text from my friend Martin, who had attended the party but left early. That toast was something. "You handling it?" I stared at the message longer than I needed to. I typed back, "I'm fine." That word, fine, has ended more conversations than truth ever could. I placed the phone face down on my kitchen counter and poured myself coffee I didn't intend to drink. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not lonely, just clarified. By that weekend, my daughter had posted a tribute on social media. Photos from the party. A caption that read, "Grateful for the man who taught me integrity and strength." Daniel was tagged. I wasn't. I didn't need public credit, but omission has a way of revealing what inclusion once concealed. I closed the app and walked into my study, the room where I kept old photo albums and financial files in the same cabinet, memories and responsibilities stored side by side. That parallel hadn't been intentional when I organized it years ago. Now it felt symbolic. I pulled out an album from 1998. There she was at 8 years old, missing her front tooth, holding a science fair ribbon. I remembered building that project volcano with her at my dining table, baking soda and vinegar staining the wood. I remembered her falling asleep in the passenger seat of my car on the drive back to her mother's house. Those weren't grand gestures. They were ordinary sacrifices. But ordinary sacrifices add up to a life. Or at least, I had believed they did. The phone rang just as I slid the album back into place. It was my estate attorney's office, confirming an appointment I had postponed twice that year. "Mr. Carter, we have you scheduled for Tuesday at 10. Will you be keeping that?" the receptionist asked. I paused. In the past, I might have delayed again, convinced there was still time to sort through family matters informally. But something about that toast, the deliberate wording, the public rewriting, removed the illusion that time would fix what pride had already solidified. "Yes," I said. "I'll be there." That night, I replayed the dinner in my mind, not to torture myself, but to examine it. I knew it sounded like justification, dissecting tone, posture, phrasing, but I needed to understand it before I could survive it. My daughter hadn't stumbled over her words. She hadn't glanced at me apologetically. She had committed to that narrative fully. And Daniel, for all his humility, had accepted it without redirecting even a fragment of credit. That told me this wasn't spontaneous gratitude. It was alignment. Monday morning brought another interruption. My neighbor Mrs. Langley stopped me as I retrieved the newspaper. "Your party looked lovely," she said. "Your son-in-law seems devoted." I didn't correct her. Daniel wasn't my son-in-law. But explaining family structures to someone outside them felt exhausting. I simply nodded again, aware that silence was becoming my most reliable response. Still, silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is preparation. I spent the afternoon reviewing financial statements at my office downtown. The building had been mine for 35 years, brick exterior aging more gracefully than I felt. My assistant, Jenna, knocked lightly before entering. "Your daughter called earlier," she said. She said she just wanted to check in. I thanked her and stared at the legal pad in front of me. Check in. That phrase carried a different weight now. Was it concern? Or maintenance? I didn't return the call that day. Instead, I opened a new folder on my desk labeled Estate Planning, Revision. The act itself felt less dramatic than the birthday toast, but infinitely more decisive. I wasn't acting out of spite. Spite is reactive. This felt intentional. I wasn't angry anymore. I was assessing. At 70, legacy stops being abstract. It becomes logistical. Names on documents. Signatures. Witnesses. That evening, as I locked up the office, my phone buzzed again. A message from my daughter. "Love you, Dad. Hope you're not overthinking the other night." I read it twice. The assumption embedded there, that my reaction would be emotional excess rather than reasonable response, settled something inside me. I typed back, "We'll talk soon." It was the most honest sentence I could manage. I didn't confront her that week. I didn't send a long message explaining what the toast had cost me. Instead, I showed up to the attorney's office Tuesday morning with a folder of financial documents and a clarity I hadn't possessed before that dinner. When Mr. Halpern asked if I wished to make adjustments to my will, I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, and as he began outlining options, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I had spent decades proving I was a father. I had assumed the title secured itself through endurance. But sitting in that leather chair, reviewing assets and beneficiaries, I understood that respect and inheritance are not the same currency. One is emotional, the other is legal. And for the first time in my life, I was prepared to treat them differently. I left his office with a draft to review and a decision forming quietly beneath it. I didn't know yet how far I would go. I only knew that I would not be rewritten in my own lifetime without response. Something had shifted at 70. And once something shifts at 70, it doesn't shift back. "Dad, you know I didn't mean it like that." Her voice came through the phone too quickly, like she had rehearsed the sentence on the drive home and couldn't wait to deploy it. I stood by the window in my office, looking down at the parking lot as employees filtered in for the day. A delivery truck idled crookedly near the curb. Life moved normally outside my glass walls. Inside them, something was being redefined. I didn't interrupt her. I wanted to hear how she would finish that thought. "People are twisting it," she continued. It was just a thank you to Daniel. It wasn't a comparison. I let a few seconds pass before I responded. Silence has a way of inviting honesty if you're patient enough to endure it. You called him the real man who raised you, I said evenly. That sounds like a comparison. I kept my tone calm, not wounded, not accusatory. If this conversation was going to shape the next chapter of our relationship, I needed to hear it clearly. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that whatever happened next would lead to a boundary I hadn't yet drawn. She exhaled sharply. Dad, you worked all the time when I was a kid. Daniel was there every day after school. He helped with homework. He showed up to recitals. There it was again. Showed up. The same phrase Daniel had used at the restaurant, now echoed in her defense. That repetition wasn't accidental. Narratives get stronger the more they're repeated. I leaned against my desk, feeling the weight of years compress into that single accusation. I worked so you could stay in that house, I said. I paid for those recitals. I stopped myself before I listed more receipts. Love measured in invoices sounds defensive, and I didn't want to sound defensive. The office door knocked lightly before Jenna stepped in with a folder. She paused when she saw me on the phone, mouthed sorry, and retreated. The interruption grounded me. Conversations like this can drift into abstraction if you're not careful. I forced myself back into the present. I'm not denying Daniel was present, I said carefully. But you're rewriting the role I played. I'm not rewriting anything, she insisted. I'm just acknowledging what I felt growing up. That sentence landed differently than the others. Feelings are harder to dispute than facts. I moved to my chair and sat down slowly, absorbing it. I wasn't perfect. I had missed things. I remembered the night she played the lead in her middle school play, and I arrived halfway through because a client meeting had run long. I remembered the look on her face, not anger, but quiet disappointment. I had told myself she would understand when she was older. Maybe she had understood. Maybe she had just remembered. I never thought you were absent, she added, her voice softening slightly. But Daniel was consistent. Consistency. Another carefully chosen word. I realized then that this wasn't about one toast. It was about years of subtle comparison that had been building while I assumed stability equaled security. I had believed that paying for braces, college tuition, and a wedding spoke louder than who stood in the kitchen at 4 p.m. I had assumed provision translated into presence. And maybe that assumption had cost me more than I understood at the time. My phone buzzed with an incoming email notification while she spoke. I glanced at the screen reflexively. It was from Mr. Halpern's office, subject line, revised beneficiary draft attached. The timing felt almost theatrical. I didn't open it, but its existence shifted my posture. I appreciate your honesty, I said finally. But words matter, especially in public. She hesitated. So what are you saying? I looked around my office, the framed certificates, the photographs of company milestones, the award plaques that once felt like proof of something meaningful. I'm saying I'm thinking, I replied. It wasn't an answer she liked. I could hear it in the way she exhaled again, this time with impatience rather than defense. You're overthinking, she said. It was one sentence. No, I thought. It was one sentence built on years of quiet reinterpretation. But I didn't argue that point aloud. Instead, I shifted the conversation gently. How are things with the house? I asked, referring to the suburban property she and her husband had purchased 3 years earlier. There was a pause on her end, brief, but noticeable. Fine, she said. Too quickly. Why? Just asking, I replied. Interest rates have been unpredictable lately. We're managing, she added, and I caught something beneath the confidence. Strain, perhaps, or pride. I made a mental note, but didn't push further. I had learned over decades that information offered voluntarily is often more revealing than information extracted under pressure. 2 days later, I received a call from my sister Carol. You've been quiet, she said without preamble. That's not like you. We met for coffee that afternoon at the small cafe near her apartment. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, while watching my face the way only siblings can. Searching for the version of me she remembered before adulthood layered itself over our personalities. She hurt you, Carol said plainly. It wasn't a question. I don't think she meant to. I replied, though even as I said it, I knew intent didn't erase impact. But meaning something and doing something are different things. I stared at the condensation on my water glass, tracing a line through it with my finger. I think she believes her version completely. Carol leaned back. And what's your version? I took a slow breath before answering. That I built the foundation she's standing on. And now she's crediting the paint. The metaphor surprised even me, but it felt accurate. Daniel hadn't dismantled anything. He had decorated it. And decoration is easier to admire than infrastructure. That evening, I opened the draft from Mr. Halpern. The language was clinical, impersonal, a redistribution of assets, a reassignment of beneficiary percentages. Reading it didn't feel vindictive. It felt clarifying. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was recalibrating. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had dismissed for years. That legacy should follow gratitude, not bloodline. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Jenna stepped in again, holding a small package. This was delivered for you, she said. The return address belonged to a young man named Marcus. Someone I had mentored through a workforce development program nearly a decade earlier. I hadn't heard from him in months. Inside the box was a handwritten note and a framed photograph of the two of us at his college graduation. You changed my life, the note read. I hope I've made you proud. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the frame solid in my hands. Pride, gratitude, recognition. Not once in his message did Marcus mention obligation or inheritance. He referenced guidance, time, belief. I realized then how differently appreciation feels when it isn't assumed. And I couldn't ignore the contrast forming in my mind. One relationship rooted in expectation, the other in voluntary respect. By the weekend, my daughter called again. Are you mad at me? She asked, skipping pleasantries. No, I said honestly. I'm reconsidering things. Like what? She pressed. Like what matters at this stage of my life, I replied. I wasn't ready to elaborate, and she sensed it. The silence stretched longer this time, heavier. Dad, she said carefully, Daniel didn't mean to overshadow you. I almost smiled at the phrasing. Overshadow implies shared light. But the toast hadn't shared it. It had redirected it. This isn't about Daniel, I said calmly. It's about understanding how you see me. Another pause. You're my father, she answered. Yes, I agreed. I am. And for the first time in our conversation, I felt the distance between title and meaning. After we hung up, I stared at Marcus's photograph again. A young man who had once arrived at my office unsure of his future now stood confident in a graduation cap, thanking me for believing in him. I hadn't expected anything from that mentorship. I certainly hadn't anticipated how much it would teach me about reciprocity. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. When he answered, surprised but warm, I asked if he might stop by the office sometime next week. I'd like to talk, I said. Of course, he replied immediately. As I ended the call, I understood that this wasn't about replacing one relationship with another. It was about aligning my legacy with truth rather than assumption. Blood had connected me to my daughter. Choice had connected me to Marcus. And choice, I was beginning to understand, carries a different kind of weight. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. Why would you want to leave anything to me? Marcus didn't sit when he asked it. He stood across from my desk, hands half raised like I'd just accused him of something. The late afternoon sun cut through the blinds behind him, striping his face in light and shadow. He had grown into his height since I first met him at 19, all nervous energy and defensive humor. Now he carried himself with steadiness. But that question, it came from the same humble disbelief he'd had back then. I didn't say I was. I replied evenly, though we both knew I hadn't invited him there to discuss the weather. I gestured toward the chair in front of my desk. Sit down. My tone wasn't stern, just grounded. The kind of tone I had used years ago when he needed direction without shame. He lowered himself slowly, eyes still searching mine for context. I just don't understand, he said after a moment. You already did enough for me. Enough. That word landed differently than the ones my daughter had used. Not consistent. Not showed up. Enough implied completion, not entitlement. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together, buying myself time to respond carefully. I'm reviewing my estate plans, I said. At my age, that's responsible. I've been thinking about impact. Marcus nodded slowly but didn't interrupt. That had always been one of his strengths, listening fully before reacting. It struck me how rarely I experienced that kind of patience in my personal life anymore. "You changed my life," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you owe me something else." There it was again. Oh, a word I hadn't heard from him once in a decade of knowing him. And in that moment, I understood something uncomfortable. Gratitude feels lighter than obligation. It doesn't press. It doesn't assume. It stands on its own and waits to be acknowledged, not demanded. 2 days earlier, my daughter had posted another photograph online. This one was older, her wedding day. Daniel stood beside her in a tailored suit, arm linked through hers as they walked down the aisle. I had been there too. I had paid for half the event. But the caption read, "The man who always stood beside me." I studied the image longer than I should have, zooming in slightly as if I might discover myself in the periphery. I wasn't there, not even cropped at the edge. Back in my office, Marcus shifted in his seat. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "You don't usually look this heavy." Heavy. That was accurate. I didn't feel angry. Anger is sharp. What I felt was dense, like something settling into its final form. "My daughter gave a speech at my birthday," I said carefully. "She thanked her stepfather as the real man who raised her." Marcus's eyebrows drew together. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, and there was no calculation in it. Just empathy. He didn't ask what I had done wrong. He didn't suggest I was overthinking. He didn't minimize it as one sentence. He let the weight of it exist without trying to shrink it. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," I added. "I'm telling you because it clarified something for me. Legacy isn't automatic. It's directional." I paused, choosing my next words with care. "I've been assuming my assets would follow blood. I'm reconsidering that assumption." The office phone rang then, sharp and inconvenient. I let it ring twice before pressing the speaker button. "Yes, Mr. Carter." Jenna's voice came through, professional but cautious. "Your daughter is online too. She says it's urgent." Marcus looked away politely, but he heard it. "Of course he did. Tell her I'll call her back," I said after a beat. Jenna hesitated for half a second. She had been with me long enough to sense the shift in family dynamics, but she complied. When the line disconnected, silence returned thicker than before. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I don't want to be in the middle of something," he said gently. "You're not," I assured him. "This isn't about replacement." Even as I said it, I knew the irony. On the surface, that's exactly what it resembled, swapping one heir for another. But internally, it felt different. It felt like alignment rather than retaliation. Blood had connected me to my daughter by biology. Choice had connected me to Marcus by investment and respect. "I never expected anything from you," Marcus continued. "When you helped me get that internship, when you paid my first semester tuition, I thought that was it. You didn't have to do more." I nodded slowly. "I know." And that was precisely the point. He hadn't expected. My daughter, on the other hand, had once joked at a holiday dinner about keeping the house in good shape since it'll be mine someday. At the time, everyone laughed. I had laughed too. But humor often carries assumption disguised as charm. 3 days later, I sat in Mr. Halpern's office again. The leather chair felt less foreign this time. "If you intend to transfer the deed during your lifetime," he explained, sliding documents across the desk, "it will remove the property from probate entirely." His tone was neutral, clinical. "Assets, beneficiaries, contingencies. The language of permanence." "I understand," I said. And I did. Transferring the house while I was still alive wasn't symbolic. It was decisive. It meant the change couldn't be contested easily later. It meant clarity. My phone buzzed against the polished wood desk. A text from my daughter. "Dad, why won't you answer me? Daniel thinks you're upset." I stared at the message, feeling neither rage nor urgency. Just confirmation. Daniel thinks. Daniel interprets. Daniel mediates. Somewhere along the line, he had become her reference point. "I'll need time to prepare the deed," Mr. Halpern continued, unaware of the personal tectonics shifting beneath the paperwork. "Once notarized, it's binding." Binding. The word echoed longer than the others. Blood binds too, I thought. But blood can also assume. Paper does not assume. It declares. That weekend, my sister Carol visited unexpectedly. She brought lemon bars and concern. "You're quiet again," she observed, setting the container on my kitchen counter. That means you're deciding something. I poured us both coffee before answering. Have you ever realized too late that you allowed someone to define you incorrectly? I asked her. She tilted her head, considering. I continued before she could respond. I let myself believe that provision was enough. That paying for things equaled being remembered for them. Carol sat across from me at the small breakfast table. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to align my legacy with truth, I said simply. The statement didn't carry drama. It carried certainty. On Monday morning, Marcus returned to my office at my request. I handed him a folder, not the final deed, but documentation outlining a trust one had begun structuring in his name. His eyes widened as he skimmed the first page. I can't accept this, he said instinctively. You're not accepting charity, I replied. You're accepting acknowledgement. I leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. You built something with what I gave you. You didn't rewrite me out of your story. He swallowed hard, emotion rising visibly in his throat. I would never do that. I believed him. And belief, I realized, is easier when it's been earned without expectation. That afternoon, my daughter left a voicemail instead of texting. Her voice cracked slightly. Dad, people are saying you met with your lawyer. Is something going on? Please just talk to me. I listened to it twice before deleting it. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Conversations that begin with suspicion rarely end with understanding. By Wednesday, the deed transfer documents were ready for review. I sat alone in my office after hours, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. I ran my hand over the edge of the paper, feeling the slight indentation where my signature would go. This wasn't about punishing my daughter. It was about refusing to subsidize a narrative that erased me. I signed the first document that evening. The rest would follow. You changed your will. She didn't knock when she entered my office. The door swung inward hard enough to rattle the glass panel, and for a brief second, every conversation outside in the reception area went silent. My daughter stood there with her purse still hanging from her shoulder, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with something between panic and accusation. Jenna looked frozen at her desk, unsure whether to intervene. I lifted my hand slightly to signal that it was fine. Close the door, I said calmly. She pushed it shut behind her, but she didn't sit. Is it true? She pressed. Did you change everything? I folded the document in front of me neatly before answering, buying myself a breath. I reviewed my estate plans, I said. Yes. My tone remained even, almost clinical. That seemed to unsettle her more than if I had shouted. Anger she could fight. Calm required her to listen. Her jaw tightened. Why would you do that without talking to me? There it was, the assumption embedded plainly this time. Without talking to me. As if the structure of my own assets required committee approval. I leaned back in my chair and studied her face carefully, looking for traces of the little girl who once ran to me with scraped knees and math tests clutched in her hand. I found pieces of her there. But layered over them was adulthood, shaped by a narrative that no longer centered me. I didn't realize I needed permission, I replied gently. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Don't do that. Don't act like this is procedural. People are saying you're giving things away. People. I wondered which people. Family friends? Daniel's relatives? The same circles that applauded the toast? And if I am? I asked quietly. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely afraid. Dad, that house is part of our future. Our. Not yours. Not mine. Ours. The word lingered in the space between us like a claim staked long before I knew it had been planted. I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not vindication. Clarity. Your future, I corrected calmly, should not depend on my death. The words hit harder than I intended. She flinched slightly, as if I had raised my voice, though I hadn't. That's not what I meant, she insisted quickly. We just always assumed. Yes, I interrupted softly. You assumed. A knock came at the door then, hesitant but necessary. Jenna cracked it open slightly. Mr. Carter, your 2 o'clock is here, she said carefully. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Time, as always, moved without regard for emotional confrontations. Reschedule, I replied without looking away from my daughter. Jenna nodded and closed the door again. You're being vindictive, my daughter said once we were alone again. This is about the speech, isn't it? I considered the accusation. Vindictive implies retaliation fueled by anger. But anger had already burned off. What remained was something steadier. It's about alignment, I said. Your speech clarified how you see me. Oh my God, she muttered, pacing now. It was one sentence. No, I said quietly. It was a summary. She stopped pacing at that, her shoulders stiffening. Daniel has been there every day since I was 12, she said defensively. He helped me through things you didn't even know about. I absorbed that without reacting outwardly. I hadn't known everything. Divorce fractures visibility. There were nights she cried in a house I no longer lived in. Conversations I wasn't part of. I had accepted that reality years ago. What I hadn't accepted, until recently, was being rewritten entirely. I never denied his presence, I said steadily. But presence doesn't erase origin. She looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. You're making this bigger than it is. No, I corrected gently. I'm acknowledging that it already was. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down reflexively, then silenced it without responding. I noticed the name on the screen, Daniel. Of course. The mediator. The interpreter. I wondered briefly if he had coached her before she arrived. Dad, she said, her voice shifting into something softer now, almost pleading. We're struggling right now. There it was. Not fully confessed, but present. Struggling how? I asked evenly. She hesitated, then sighed. The mortgage is tight. Rates went up. We thought maybe, eventually, we could move into your place. It would make things easier. Easier. The house I had maintained for 40 years reduced to a solution for fluctuating interest rates. I nodded slowly, letting her words settle without immediate judgment. I understood financial strain. I had lived it. I had sacrificed for it. But I had never structured my sacrifices around entitlement. I see, I said finally. You always said you wanted to help, she added quickly, as if building a case. I did, I agreed. And I have. Silence filled the room again, thicker this time. I could see the calculation behind her eyes now. Not cruel, but practical. She was measuring outcomes. We both were. Later that afternoon, after she left without resolution, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. He had never called me directly before. Not once in 15 years. I answered. Look, he began, skipping pleasantries. I don't know what's going on, but she's upset. I gathered that. I replied calmly. She thinks you're punishing her. I'm not punishing anyone, I said evenly. I'm making decisions. He exhaled audibly. About the house. Yes. There was a pause long enough to feel strategic. That house means security for her, he said finally. And what did I mean? I asked quietly. The question lingered between us, unanswered. After a moment, he shifted tactics. Families shouldn't operate like contracts. No, I agreed softly. They shouldn't. But sometimes contracts clarify what families obscure. He didn't respond to that. The conversation ended shortly after, polite but strained. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at my home confirming the deed transfer process was nearing completion. I held the envelope in my hands for several minutes before opening it, feeling the weight of its finality. This wasn't theoretical anymore. It was procedural. That evening, my daughter sent a long message. It was the first one that sounded less defensive and more emotional. I never meant to erase you. I just felt closer to Daniel growing up because he was physically there. That doesn't mean I don't love you. I read it twice. Love and recognition are not identical. I had loved her through absence and exhaustion. But love that isn't acknowledged can begin to feel like mythology, something spoken about but not witnessed. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I drove past the old neighborhood where she grew up. The house her mother had kept after the divorce still stood, shutters freshly painted. I remembered handing over the keys years ago without argument, because stability mattered more than pride. I had assumed those choices would echo positively someday. Maybe they had, just not publicly. By the weekend, gossip had traveled further. A cousin called to check in. An old colleague asked if I was downsizing. The narrative was forming without my participation. That was fine. I had lived long enough to understand that explanations rarely change opinions already settled. On Monday morning, I met with Mr. Halpern again. Once notarized, he reminded me, the transfer is complete. His pen hovered over the signature line. It's not finished yet, I said quietly. But it will be. He nodded, professional and detached. As I left his office, my phone buzzed once more. A voicemail notification. My daughter's voice, tight with restrained tears. Dad, please don't do anything final without talking to me. We can figure this out. I stood in the parking lot, keys in hand, staring at the horizon beyond the city buildings. Figure this out. The phrase implied negotiation. But some realizations aren't negotiable. They're acknowledgments of truth. The deed transfer was scheduled for notarization the following week. And once ink meets paper, it doesn't ask permission to exist. She was crying before she even sat down. Not dramatic crying. Not loud. The kind that gathers quietly in the corners of your eyes and spills over despite your effort to contain it. She stood in the doorway of my office again, but this time she knocked first. That difference didn't go unnoticed. Her shoulders looked smaller somehow, as if whatever certainty had fueled her last visit had dissolved into something heavier. Dad, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Can we talk? I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. Of course. She sat slowly, placing her purse on her lap like armor she wasn't sure would protect her. The room felt different than it had the week before. Not hostile, just final. The late afternoon sun filtered in again through the blinds, catching the edges of the framed photographs on my bookshelf. Company milestones, charity events, Marcus's graduation picture. I wondered if she noticed that one. I know you're finalizing things, she began carefully. Daniel told me you met with the lawyer again. There it was, confirmation that he was still involved in our private conversations. I folded my hands together on the desk. I did. She wiped her eyes quickly. We're in trouble. The words landed without drama, but they carried weight. I didn't interrupt. I had learned that silence invites truth more effectively than pressure ever could. The mortgage adjusted, she continued, staring at her hands. And Tom's hours were cut back last quarter. We've been juggling payments. Credit cards. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to think we were irresponsible. I nodded once, absorbing it. Financial strain is rarely about irresponsibility alone. It's about timing, risk, pride, and sometimes overconfidence. I had known that firsthand decades ago. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked gently. She hesitated. Because we thought, eventually, the house. Her voice trailed off, and she looked up at me with something close to fear. We thought we'd have a safety net. There it was again. Safety net. Not father. Not relationship. Structure. Asset. I felt no anger rise in me. Only clarity settling deeper into place. I reached into the drawer beside my desk and removed a large envelope, thick with documents. I placed it gently on the polished wood surface between us, but didn't slide it forward yet. I never promised you that house, I said calmly. You didn't have to, she replied quickly. It was understood. I tilted my head slightly. Understood by whom? Her breathing grew uneven. By everyone. A knock interrupted us then. Jenna cracked the door open softly. Mr. Carter, your 5 o'clock is here. Should I? Give me 15 minutes, I said without looking away from my daughter. The door closed again, and silence returned. My daughter's eyes drifted to the envelope on the desk. She knew. Maybe not the details, but the direction. Her voice dropped lower. Dad, please tell me you haven't done anything irreversible. I exhaled slowly, aware that this moment was the hinge between assumption and reality. I finalized the deed transfer this morning, I said. Her face drained of color. Transferred it to who? I slid the envelope toward her then. The paper made a soft scraping sound against the desk, a sound I would remember later for its ordinariness. Major life shifts rarely arrive with orchestral music. They arrive with paperwork. She opened it with trembling fingers, flipping through the notarized pages. The legal language was dense, impersonal, unmistakable. When she reached the second page, her breath caught audibly. Marcus, she whispered. Yes. Her eyes snapped up to mine, disbelief overtaking grief. The intern? The one you mentored? He's not an intern anymore, I replied evenly. He's a business owner. A father. A man who built something with what he was given. And I didn't, she shot back, hurt sharpening her tone. You built a life? I said calmly. And I supported you in doing that. College tuition, wedding expenses, the down payment assistance when you bought your house. That was your job, she said automatically, and then immediately looked as though she wished she could retrieve the words. There it was. Not malicious, not cruel, just revealing. My job, I repeated softly. Is that how you see it? Tears spilled freely now. I didn't mean it like that. I believed her. But intent and impact are rarely twins. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of 70 years settle into my posture. I didn't do this to hurt you, I said quietly. I did this because I realized something. She shook her head, overwhelmed. Because of one speech. No, I corrected gently. Because of what that speech represented. She looked down at the papers again, scanning as if searching for a loophole. This is permanent, she whispered. Yes. Her shoulders began to shake then, not theatrically, but genuinely. We were counting on that house, she admitted finally. Daniel said you'd never actually change anything, that you were just upset. I absorbed that without flinching. Daniel had bet on my predictability, on my history of endurance without confrontation, on my tendency to absorb slight after slight in the name of peace. He hadn't anticipated that something in me had shifted permanently at 70. I'm not upset, I said calmly. I'm aligned. She looked up at me through tears, confusion etched across her face. Aligned with what? With truth, I replied. Another knock at the door, firmer this time. Jenna again. Mr. Carter? 5 more minutes, I called. My daughter wiped her face with the back of her hand. So that's it, she asked. You're just done? I'm not done being your father, I said carefully. But I'm done financing a narrative that erases me. Her breathing slowed slightly as the words settled in. I never meant to erase you. I know, I said softly. But you did. Silence filled the space between us again, but this time it wasn't charged. It was heavy with realization. I need help, she said finally, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. Not inheritance, just help. That sentence mattered. It wasn't about future ownership anymore. It was about present need. I leaned forward slightly. Help is different than entitlement, I said gently. Help requires honesty. She nodded weakly. I can help you create a plan, I continued. Financial restructuring. Budget review. I can even loan money if necessary, structured, documented. But the house is no longer part of that equation. She looked at the papers one more time before sliding them back toward me. Daniel's going to say you replaced me. I felt a flicker of something. Not anger, not guilt. Just fatigue. I didn't replace you, I said evenly. I redirected my legacy. Her lips trembled again, but she didn't argue this time. She stood slowly, gripping the purse strap like she needed something solid to hold on to. I thought blood meant something unchangeable, she said quietly. It does, I replied. But respect does too. She stared at me for a long moment, as if memorizing my face in a new context. Then she turned toward the door. Dad? She said before opening it. Yes. Is there anything I can do to fix this? I considered the question carefully. Some fractures can be repaired. Others become part of the structure. Not today, I said honestly. She nodded once, accepting more than she wanted to. Then she walked out. The office felt quieter than usual after she left, though the receptionist's phone continued ringing and keyboards kept tapping beyond the glass. Life didn't pause for emotional reckonings. I knew once she read that second page, nothing between us would remain the same. And next time she came through that door, it wouldn't be to negotiate. It would be to confront. I'm still your daughter. She said it standing in the center of my office, not crying this time, not pacing, not accusing. Just stating it, as if the sentence itself carried legal authority. As if biology were a contract that overruled notarized documents and quiet decisions made over months of clarity. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. Outside the glass wall, I could see Jenna deliberately keeping her head down, pretending not to listen. And for the first time in 70 years, I didn't let that sentence control me. Yes, I said calmly. You are. I didn't rush to soften it. I didn't add qualifiers like always will be or nothing changes that. Those phrases would have reassured her, and reassurance was what she came for. But reassurance without reflection would have undone everything I had finally understood about myself. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, waiting for the version of me who would cave for harmony. I don't understand how you can do this, she continued, her voice steadier than before, but edged with frustration. You mentored him. That's admirable. But he's not family. The word hung there. Family. Defined by blood. Defined by tradition. Defined by expectation. I leaned back slowly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind for days. Not the exact words, but the posture. Calm. Clear. Final. Family isn't erased by a deed, I said evenly. But neither is respect. She exhaled sharply. You're acting like I disowned you. No, I replied softly. You reassigned me. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had shared in the past. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't defending my resume as a father. I was stating a reality I had finally accepted. She had built a narrative in which Daniel was the consistent figure and I was the distant provider. That narrative might have comforted her. It might have even been partially true, but it wasn't complete. And being incomplete publicly, at 70, felt like erasure. Her phone buzzed in her hand again. She didn't check it this time. Daniel thinks you're making an emotional decision, she said carefully. He thinks you'll regret it. I almost smiled at that. Daniel had spent years being seen as the steady one, the present one, the emotionally available one. But he didn't know me in my quiet hours. He didn't know how long I had sat with this before signing anything. I've never been more certain, I said calmly. She crossed her arms, defensive again. So what, that's it? He gets your house? Your legacy? And I get what? A budget spreadsheet. The sarcasm didn't sting. It clarified. You get honesty, I said evenly, and the opportunity to build without assuming. She stared at me as if trying to locate the man she once knew. I understood the disorientation. For decades, I had absorbed conflict rather than drawing lines. I had convinced myself that endurance equaled virtue, that patience would be rewarded with recognition eventually. But recognition doesn't arrive automatically. Sometimes it has to be demanded, not loudly, but firmly. A knock came at the door. Jenna stepped in halfway. Mr. Carter, the courier is here for the final copy signatures. Send him in 5 minutes, I replied. My daughter's eyes widened slightly. Final copy? Yes. Her jaw tightened. So you really went through with it? I did. She sat down abruptly in the chair across from my desk, as if her legs could no longer support her. For a moment, she looked young again, not 8 years old, not innocent, but overwhelmed. I never thought you'd choose someone else over me, she said quietly. That sentence mattered. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. This isn't about choosing someone over you, I said carefully. It's about choosing not to be taken for granted. Her eyes filled again, but this time she held the tears back. I wasn't taking you for granted. You were counting on me without acknowledging me, I replied gently. There's a difference. The air between us felt dense, but not volatile. We were no longer arguing about a speech. We were dissecting identity. I realized then that I had spent years wanting gratitude from her without admitting it to myself. I told myself I didn't need it, that fathers shouldn't expect applause. But I hadn't expected applause. I had expected accuracy. I loved you the only way I knew how, I continued quietly. By providing, by sacrificing, by staying steady even when it meant being unseen. I don't regret that, but I won't finance a version of history that edits me out. She swallowed hard. So what happens now? I considered that carefully. This was the moment where I could soften everything, promise eventual reconsideration, leave the door slightly open for renegotiation. That would have eased her fear. It would have restored my image as dependable, predictable, safe. But it would have undone the boundary I had finally drawn. What happens now, I said evenly, is that we have a relationship based on reality, not expectation. And if I can't accept that, she asked. I held her gaze steadily. Then we both adjust. The courier knocked lightly and entered with a folder. He placed it on my desk and pointed to the flagged signature lines. I signed without hesitation, each stroke deliberate and calm. My daughter watched in silence. When I finished, the courier gathered the documents and left without understanding the weight of what he had witnessed. It's done, I said simply. She stood slowly, the finality settling into her posture. You're really not going to change your mind. No. Her voice cracked slightly despite her effort to remain composed. I thought blood meant automatic forgiveness. Blood means connection, I said gently. Forgiveness requires accountability. She stared at me for a long moment, searching for something. Softness, perhaps. I didn't withhold compassion. I withheld reversal. I'm still your daughter, she repeated, quieter now. And I'm still your father, I replied. But fatherhood isn't ownership, and neither is inheritance. She nodded once, absorbing more than she wanted to. I stood then, not abruptly, but decisively. I walked around the desk and toward the door. She followed without speaking. When I opened it, Jenna looked up briefly before returning to her computer screen. In the hallway, my daughter hesitated. I hope you don't regret this, she said softly. I don't, I answered. She stepped out into the lobby. I walked her to the outer office door, opened it, and handed her a certified copy of the notarized documents, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as acknowledgement. She took them with trembling hands. I love you, she said quietly. I know, I replied. And I meant it. She left without another word. The door closed softly behind her, and the office returned to its usual rhythm. Phones ringing, printers humming, muted conversations drifting through glass. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle into something steady rather than hollow. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. Later that evening, I called Marcus. It's finalized, I told him. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure? He asked gently. Yes, I said. I've never been more sure of anything. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office, looking at the city lights beginning to flicker on outside. Legacy isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who reflects your values. I hadn't disowned my daughter. I had simply stopped underwriting a story that diminished me. At 70, I finally understood that standing up late is still standing up. And if you've ever been quietly replaced in your own life, if you've ever smiled through a moment that rewrote you, then you already know this truth. Respect isn't inherited. It's recognized. And sometimes you have to rewrite the ending yourself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been quietly rewritten in your own family, or finally found the strength to draw a boundary after years of silence, then you already understand how heavy these decisions can be. Go ahead and like this video so more people who need to hear it can find it. Share it with someone who might be struggling to stand up for themselves. And subscribe to the channel for more real, unfiltered family stories about loyalty, betrayal, and the moment we finally choose self-respect over silence. Because sometimes the hardest boundaries are the ones that save us. I'll see you in the next story.